"Please, don't come any closer." But she never imagined what he was about to do. An empty road, a 19-year-old girl running from what she can't say out loud. "Please, don't come any closer" is a story about fear, safe harbor, and the kind of courage that's born in silence. Subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The asphalt ended where the dust began, and the dust seemed to go on forever. The wind spun in low eddies, lifting dry clouds that burned her eyes and clung to her sweaty skin. Grace Miller, 19, walked with her body pitched forward, as if the weight of her own history were heavier than the light backpack hanging from her shoulders. Every step was an act of will. The soles of her feet were worn thin, dust stuck to her tender, aching feet, and the air tasted like rust. The road was narrow, bordered by empty fields and abandoned sheds. Sometimes she thought she heard voices far off, but they were only memories. She had slipped out of the house in the night, when shadows were allies, and fear hadn't yet found a shape. Now fear walked beside her, unseen but present in every short breath, every glance over her shoulder. The horizon seemed to mock her fragility, and still she kept moving. She kept moving because stopping meant remembering. And remembering, for Grace, felt like reopening an old wound. Dawn arrived like a cold blade. The sky opened in pale tones, and the light revealed everything the darkness had tried to hide. Her hands were cut, her face marked by exhaustion, and her eyes were hollow, as if they held a secret too heavy for someone so young. The air smelled of iron and dry grass. The wind carried the distant call of a crow, and for a moment she thought someone was following her. Frightened, she crouched behind a barbed wire fence, her heart racing, her body reacting before her mind could catch up. At every sound, her muscles tensed. She had learned to live that way, ready to defend herself, even when there was no attack. The road ahead was empty, and the silence was cruel. Only the whisper of the wind and the hum of old memories kept pace with her steps. Grace's body was a map of what survival means. Endurance, even when the soul has already given up. When the sun climbed high, the heat turned punishing. Her clothes stuck to her skin. Sweat stung her sensitive skin and her knees shook. Her backpack slipped off, and she didn't have the strength to pick it up. She sat at the edge of the road, trying to breathe, her chest heaving as if the air were too heavy. Time seemed to melt. Then suddenly, a sound ripped through the quiet, the deep growl of an engine. An old truck rolled toward her, slow, bouncing over the gravel. Grace froze, instinct telling her to run, but her body wouldn't obey. The vehicle stopped a few yards ahead. The door creaked and a man climbed down. Broad-shouldered, flannel shirt, the posture of someone shaped by years of work under the sun. He scanned the area, alert, until his eyes found her. Grace drew back, panic rising through her. He raised one hand, calm and steady, and said, "You're okay." She didn't believe him. His voice was firm, and that paradoxically scared her even more. He took a step forward. It was enough for her to plead, in a trembling whisper, almost without air, "Please, don't come any closer." The words echoed on the empty road, like both a request and a warning. He stopped. The wind moved between them, lifting dust and dry leaves. His eyes weren't like the ones she knew. No fury, no hurry, just something close to concern. He drew a long breath, tipped his hat down and stood still, respecting the distance. Behind him, another voice, soft and female, broke the air. "Richard, what happened?" A woman appeared, a scarf tied at her neck and a metal pail in her hands. The man turned and gave a small gesture toward the fence. She looked, and when she spotted Grace's shadow, she let the pail fall. She walked slowly, stopping a few feet away. Her eyes were calm, her voice steady. "It's all right, sweetheart. You're safe here." Her name was Mary Collins, and the serenity in her face said more than any speech could. Grace was still hidden, but her body could no longer hold its own weight. Mary reached out without touching, simply offering her hand. "Come on, it's okay. We can help you." Something in those words dismantled Grace's defenses, the look of someone who had seen pain and still chose to believe in people. Little by little, the girl stood, stumbling, her face streaked with dust and hair. Their eyes met. Grace is full of suspicion, Mary's full of compassion. Richard stepped to the side, making room. "There's water in the truck," he said quietly. Grace hesitated, glanced at the empty horizon, and then, for the first time, took a step toward someone. Dust lifted off the ground, and the sound of her breathing blended with the idling engine, as if the whole world had paused to witness that moment. Inside the truck, the air was hot, and the smell of gasoline mingled with old wood. Mary sat beside Grace and handed her a bottle of water. The girl drank in short sips, her eyes fixed on the window, as if expecting someone to appear behind them. Richard drove in silence, his hands steady on the wheel, eyes fixed on the road. Mary tried to make small talk, but Grace only nodded, unable to form sentences. Exhaustion took over. The road stretched out ahead of them, long and empty, and the truck rolled on, taking each bend with patience. Outside, the sun began to sink, washing the horizon in orange. Inside, a different kind of silence settled. Not the silence that hurts, the kind that shelters. And as the truck disappeared among the hills, Grace rested her head against the glass and closed her eyes. For the first time in a long while, fear was no longer riding in the back seat. The road ended at a white-painted wooden fence, weathered by time. The gate creaked when Richard pushed it with his shoulder, and the truck rolled in slowly, kicking up a cloud of dust that drifted through the warm, late afternoon air. The house was simple, old-fashioned, with blue shutters and smoke curling from the chimney. Grace watched everything through the cracked window, unsure whether she was being taken to a safe place or led into another kind of trap. Mary climbed out first, walked around, and opened the passenger door, offering her hand. "Come on, sweetheart. You're safe now." The tone wasn't pushy, just an invitation. Grace stepped down, body trembling, bare feet meeting the rough yard. The dog barked once, then wagged its tail and wandered off. Richard picked up her backpack carefully, as if it was something fragile. From the kitchen drifted the smell of burning firewood, mingled with the sweet aroma of fresh-baked bread. Inside, the house felt alive. Wooden furniture, floral curtains, a big table covered with a checkered cloth. Every corner seemed to hold a memory, and the wall clock ticked in a rhythm that didn't match the rest of the world. Mary pointed toward a back room. "You can stay here. It's simple, but it's yours." The space was small, a neatly made bed, a light quilt, a window looking out over the fields. Grace stepped in slowly, brushing the fabric with her fingertips, as if confirming it was real. The setting sun streamed through the glass and threw golden bars across the floor. Mary set a clean change of clothes on the chair, a glass of water on the nightstand, and slipped out. When the door closed, the silence returned. But it was a different kind of silence, not the kind that comes before fear, but the kind that offers rest. Grace sat on the edge of the bed, hands in her lap, and for the first time in many days, breathed without hurrying. In the kitchen, the clink of dishes and the low crackle of the fire filled the air. Richard watched his wife in quiet, the way he always did when he didn't know what to say. "She's really shaken," Mary said, stirring a pot of soup. "She's going to need time." He just nodded, washing his hands at the sink. They exchanged a brief look, heavy with understanding. Neither asked what had happened. They knew some answers hurt more than they help. When the soup was ready, the smell drifted down the hallway. Mary tapped gently on the door. "There's food if you want it. You don't have to talk, just eat." Grace didn't answer, but a few minutes later, her footsteps sounded on the wooden floor. She sat at the table, shoulders tucked in, watching the steam rise from the bowl. The first spoonful came with silent tears she tried to hide by looking down. Mary pretended not to notice and just kept eating, respecting the kind of pain that doesn't need commentary. In the days that followed, time seemed to slow. Grace slept for long stretches, startled awake by any noise, but little by little her body began to understand that this roof didn't shelter threats. Every morning Mary left folded clothes on the chair and hot tea on the table. Richard left at dawn to work the pasture and returned in the afternoon, always with the same steady stride and earth-stained hands. Sometimes he left fruit in the kitchen, sometimes nothing. Life together was made of gestures, not questions. Grace watched every move, trying to decide if she could trust them. As the routine repeated, her body loosened just a bit each day. The wind rattling the windows no longer made her flinch. The crackle of the fire began to sound like company, not a warning. The house seemed to breathe with her, slow, patient, alive. One night when the cold tightened its grip, Mary knocked on the door with an extra blanket in her arms. "Winters here can be tricky," she said with a faint smile. Grace took the blanket and mumbled a soft thank you. Mary noticed her hands, thin and marked. "Do you like to sew? I've got some old clothes that need mending." Grace hesitated, then nodded. Mary smiled. "Tomorrow I'll show you where I keep the thread." It was the kind of small talk that didn't seem important, but it opened a crack of light. After she left, Grace lay back and stared at the ceiling, breathing in the scent of bread from the kitchen. It was the first time that smell didn't bring back something bad. She closed her eyes, and her tired body finally gave in to sleep. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, and the house seemed to whisper that the worst had passed, even if she wasn't ready to believe it yet. The next morning, gentle light slipped through the curtains. Mary made coffee and pancakes while Richard fed the animals in the barn. Grace woke to the sound of an old radio playing something soft. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming. The sweet smell, the clatter of pans, the low murmur of voices, it all felt like it came from a time when things were still simple. When she got up, she saw through the window the couple walking side by side toward the chicken coop, laughing at something small. It was an ordinary scene, but to her it felt almost impossible, a portrait of peace. Inside, something shifted, as if her soul were beginning to remember what it means to be alive. Grace knew she still carried a past full of hurt, but in that moment, under the soft light and the scent of warm bread, a shy certainty took root. Maybe, just maybe, she had finally found a place where fear no longer called the shots. The days that followed arrived gently, as if time itself had decided to slow down so she could keep pace. Dawn was still bitter cold, but the morning sun brought a warmth that felt like an invitation to stay alive. Grace started waking earlier, listening to Richard's footsteps in the yard and the house doors creaking open one by one. Sometimes she watched him through the window, feeding the horses with slow, precise movements, the calm look of someone who knows the rhythm of the land. Mary had coffee ready before the sun even showed, and the aroma drifted through every room. On the third morning, Grace got up without being called. She walked to the kitchen, hesitant, and asked if she could help. Mary answered with a simple smile. She placed an apron in Grace's hands and pointed to a basket of fruit. "Start by washing these. The water helps you wake up." Grace did as she was told, and that small gesture marked the beginning of a routine. Working with her hands was a kind of therapy she couldn't explain, but her body understood it. With every task, sweeping the floor, dusting the shelves, folding laundry, her mind seemed to fall into place in silence. The past still came in short flashes, but it no longer ruled the present. When her heart raced for no reason, she looked out the window and saw Richard walking the fields, his boots sinking into the mud, the dogs racing around him. That picture somehow made her feel safe. Sometimes he asked her to help with small jobs in the barn, hold the ladder, separate hay, fetch tools. There was never any rush, never any pressure. He spoke little, always calmly. Grace got used to that kind of quiet, the kind that doesn't threaten, but simply stays. One day, when he noticed how awkwardly she was holding a bucket, he chuckled, a low, restrained laugh. "It's not a test, kiddo, just a bucket." She laughed too, without realizing it was the first time in a long while. Afternoons on the farm had a sound all their own. The wind whistled through the gaps, the nearby stream murmured, and the animals kept a natural rhythm that seemed to cradle the air. Grace began to recognize that sound as something that healed her. Sometimes Mary sat on the porch, sewing, while Grace swept the yard or hung clothes to dry. Between tasks, they traded a few words, but each small exchange carried real weight. "When we work the land, it works on us too," Mary would say, sewing without looking up. Grace never knew how to answer, but she tucked those phrases away inside her. At night, she helped with dinner. Mary cooked as if she were praying, slow, methodical, respectful. The clatter of pots, the scent of garlic in the pan, the crackle of the wood stove created a kind of comfort she had never known. And when she sat at the table between the two of them, she felt the world could stop there for a moment, without threats or shouting. One morning, Richard handed her a pair of old gloves. "You're helping in the pen today." Grace's eyes widened. He smiled. "I promise the cows are better behaved than most people." The joke made her laugh. She spent the whole day by his side, learning to rake hay with a pitchfork, handle ropes, and steer clear of the larger animals. Her body grew tired, but with the good kind of tired, the kind that doesn't hurt. When they came back to the house, Mary was waiting with fresh juice and warm bread. "Look at you, already a working woman," she said, brushing a strand of hair from Grace's face. Grace didn't answer, but she smiled for real. Her skin was still dusty, her hair pulled back any old way, but her eyes had a spark. The kind of spark that only appears when a soul starts to remember it's made of hope. Mary noticed, but didn't mention it. She let the quiet speak for both of them. As the weeks passed, Grace began to inhabit the house naturally. She put the dishes away, helped fold sheets, tended the flowers in the yard. Sometimes she sat on the porch steps to watch the sunset, and Richard joined her, saying nothing. He'd light his pipe and stare out at the horizon, and that shared silence was enough. From the other side of the window, Mary watched them with tenderness. None of them knew exactly what was happening, but all of them felt that something was being rebuilt there. One night after dinner, Mary took an old notebook from a drawer and handed it to Grace. "When the words want to come, let them come in here." The girl held the notebook for a moment, unsure what to say. Then she pressed it to her chest, as if accepting something sacred. In that simple gesture, Mary had given her more than paper. She had given her voice back. At the end of that week, heavy rain set in. The roof dripped in a few places, and the smell of wet earth slipped into the house. Grace stood on the porch, watching the drops stream down the wood. For a moment, the sound of the rain tangled with old memories. Doors slamming, distant shouting, the fear of being found. But when she looked back inside, she saw Mary in the kitchen making soup and Richard repairing a saddle, his face at ease. Those images washed away the echoes of the past. The rain no longer felt like a threat. It was a song. Grace drew a deep breath, feeling her chest ache in a different way, not from fear, but from emotion. There, between the scent of firewood and the drum of water on the roof, she realized her body was starting to let go. Maybe, little by little, she could trust again. And when Mary called her in, she answered with a steady voice, like someone finally learning how to live. The storm began late in the afternoon, announced by heavy clouds piling up over the hills of Willow Creek. The wind came first, whistling through the trees and slamming the windows like warning drums. Then the sky split open with flashes and thunder. Grace was in her room, reading by a dim lamp, when everything went dark at once. The power snapped out and blackness swallowed the house. For a moment, the roar of the hard rain tangled with memories she was trying to forget. Her body reacted before her mind, heart racing, hands shaking, breath caught in her chest. She backed into the corner, hugging her knees, trying to steady her breathing. Outside, thunder crashed with force, and every lightning flash lit the room for a second, exposing the fear written across her face. Time felt like it had slipped backward. She no longer knew if she was on the farm or back in the hell she'd left behind. Mary slept in the next room, the wind muffling every sound. Richard, however, was still awake. He usually waited for the rain to ease before turning in, watching the fields from the living room window. That's when he heard it, a small, stifled sound from the hallway. He grabbed a flashlight, clicked it on, and walked quietly to Grace's door. He knocked softly and got no answer. Knocked again. "Grace? Nothing, just the storm." He eased the door open. The beam cut through the dark and stopped at the corner of the room. She was there, curled up tight, her body rigid, her eyes far away. He didn't say a word. He stepped inside, sat on the floor with his back to the opposite wall, and set the flashlight on the rug, angled upward so it spread a gentle glow across the ceiling. The rain was deafening, but between them there was a kind of silence that felt more human than anything either of them could have said. Richard didn't ask what was wrong, didn't try to talk her down. He just stayed, breathing in time with her as if sharing air so she could keep going. Minutes stretched into hours. Sometimes he looked toward the window. Sometimes he studied the floor. Little by little, Grace began to understand that this silence wasn't a threat. It was presence, a kind of care that didn't demand anything in return. The wind finally started to fade, and the thunder moved off. The rain softened into a song. Richard picked up the flashlight, stood, and said only, "It's all right now." Then he stepped out, closing the door gently behind him. Grace stared at the sliver of light under the door. She cried, but not out of terror, out of relief. It was the first time someone had stayed, without asking for anything, without hurting, without disappearing. By morning, the farm was wrapped in a damp mist. The smell of wet earth filled the air. Grace walked downstairs slowly, her body feeling oddly light. She found Mary in the kitchen making coffee. "Did you sleep okay?" Mary asked, and the question sounded genuinely kind. Grace nodded and sat at the table. They were quiet for a while, and then Grace spoke. The words came rough and short, but enough to open old wounds. She didn't give details. She didn't need to. Mary understood from the way her voice faltered. That kind of pain didn't come from simple sadness. It came from being silenced for far too long. Mary stepped closer, touched her shoulder lightly, and said, "You're home now." Grace drew a deep breath, closed her eyes, and something inside her gave way. It was as if a part that had always been on guard was finally learning to rest. Outside, Richard repaired a fence the night wind had knocked down. The cold breeze cut across the field, and he kept his gaze far off. He didn't speak about what had happened, but he kept thinking of the girl in that dark room, the frightened eyes that hadn't trusted him and yet had asked for help without a word. He had never been good with emotions. Since losing their small son years ago, he'd avoided stepping into other people's pain. He used to think time fixed everything. But seeing Grace, he realized some wounds don't fade, they need tending. That afternoon when he came back, Mary was on the porch sewing. "She talked to me today," Mary said without looking up. "Not the whole story, but enough." Richard nodded. "I figured." He stood there a few seconds longer, like a man sorting through feelings that don't quite fit into words. Later, over dinner, the mood was light, but changed. Grace looked at them and saw a natural ease in everything they did, as if this couple had learned to live with their losses without losing sight of what remained. After they ate, Mary washed the dishes and said softly, "You know, sometimes I think God sent that girl to remind us we can still help somebody." Richard dried a glass, thoughtful. For a moment he didn't reply. Then he murmured, "Maybe that's it." It was rare to hear him agree with anything that touched on faith, but there was honesty in his voice. Mary smiled, and the comfortable quiet returned. Outside, the wind no longer carried thunder, only the clean scent of the fields. Upstairs, Grace wrote in the notebook Mary had given her, and for the first time the words came easily, not about pain, but about gratitude. The storm had passed, both outside and within the house. Weeks turned into months, and time drifted unhurriedly in Willow Creek. The cold gave way to a gentle spring warmth, and the flowers Grace had planted behind the barn began to bloom. Mornings now smelled like coffee and bread, and the old radio filled the kitchen with classic songs. Grace moved through the house with steady steps, no longer acting like someone afraid of being seen. The tension in her face had softened into calm. The notebook Mary had given her was almost full. Pages of small handwriting recording simple details, the birdsong, the sunrise, the feel of rain on the windows. Between notes, fragments surfaced. Bits of memory, hints of fear, dreams not yet defined. Writing had become the refuge where she could hear herself again. Sometimes Mary read a line or two when Grace left the notebook on the table. She never commented, just smiled quietly, knowing each sentence was a small victory over the past. Life on the farm followed its steady rhythm. Richard fixed fences, tended the horses, and kept the same calm gaze, though each day he seemed more attuned to the girl who now worked alongside him. Mary sewed for neighbors, and Grace learned by her side, sharing laughter over fabric and bright spools of thread. The farm had become the home she'd never had. But peace, like the wind, always shifts direction. One afternoon, while Richard was filling the truck in town, the local sheriff approached with a serious look. "Collins, I need to tell you something," he began, adjusting his hat. "A man came through asking about a young woman. Says he's family. Looking for someone named Grace Miller." The words landed heavy. Richard kept his face neutral, but his chest tightened. "You tell him where she is?" he asked softly. The sheriff shook his head. "Of course not. Just figured you should know." The guy seemed persistent. When Richard came home, he brought silence with him. He ate quietly, avoiding his wife's eyes. Mary noticed the weight on his shoulders and waited until Grace went upstairs. "What happened?" she asked. He took a breath and repeated what the sheriff had said. Mary closed her eyes for a moment, like someone trying to push back a bad feeling. "She can't hear this yet," she murmured. Richard agreed, but fate didn't wait for them to decide. Grace, who'd come down for a blanket, had heard everything from the hallway. She stood frozen, heart pounding, the floor dropping out beneath her. The sheriff's words echoed in her mind. The man's name felt like an old threat come back to life. The past was closer than she'd imagined. She returned to her room in silence, and when she lay down, her body trembled as if the entire farm might collapse at any moment. Fear, an old enemy asleep inside her, had started breathing again. The next morning, Grace avoided coming downstairs. She sat on the edge of the bed, clutching her notebook, unsure what to do. The words wouldn't come. The air felt heavier. Even the wind sounded different. Mary knocked, carrying a cup of tea. "Heard you skipped breakfast." Grace lifted her eyes and whispered, "Who's looking for me?" Mary froze for a beat. The girl already knew. She sat beside her, took a steady breath, and answered calmly, "The sheriff told Richard. A man showed up, said he's a relative. That's all." Grace shut her eyes, fighting back tears. "He's going to take me back." Mary clasped her hands firmly. "No, he isn't. You don't have to go anywhere you don't want to. Do you hear me? Here you have a choice." The words dropped like an anchor in the storm building inside Grace. For the first time, someone told her the power to stay was hers. The day dragged by, in tense quiet. Richard left early to speak with the sheriff and confirm what the man wanted. When he returned, his expression gave him away. He isn't a father or a legal guardian. Says he wants to take her back home, but he's got no papers. Mary crossed her arms. "Then he's not taking her. Simple as that." Richard nodded, but worry lingered in his eyes. "These things don't usually end simple." Grace heard part of the conversation from the kitchen and decided to come in. They fell silent when she appeared. "If he shows up, I'll talk to him," she said, her voice steady, surprising them both. "You don't need to get involved," Richard answered without hesitation. "We're not letting you handle this alone." She started to protest, but Mary stepped forward and simply hugged her. "You've been through enough. Let us take care of this now." In that embrace, Grace realized she wasn't alone anymore in facing the ghosts that had returned. In the days that followed, the man didn't show, but the tension stayed. Grace slept poorly again, waking at the faintest sound. Even so, something in her had changed. Fear no longer ruled. It coexisted with a new courage. She kept writing in the notebook, but the pages read differently now. She wasn't running, she was standing her ground. Mary noticed the shift in tone, less despair, more resolve. Richard reinforced the fences, added extra locks to the windows, and fell asleep with the radio on, as if sound itself could keep the past at bay. One night, before turning out the lights, Mary looked through the window and saw Grace standing on the porch, staring into the dark field. The girl didn't look scared, just watchful. The wind moved her hair, and there was firmness in her gaze. Fear was still there, but with it something new was taking shape. Strength. And in that moment, Mary understood that even if the past returned, Grace was no longer the lost girl they'd found by the side of the road. Time moved like a calm river, carrying fear away and bringing back the sound of life. The man who'd come looking for her never returned, and the town of Willow Creek slipped back into its usual rhythm, where every morning seemed like the one before. But for Grace, nothing was the same. The danger had receded, maybe because justice stepped in, maybe because some things lose strength with distance. The farm was still her shelter, but now it was also her home. Her body still carried scars, and her mind still held memories, but the trauma no longer ran her days. Grace woke early, tied up her hair, and headed out to help Richard with the animals. The sun warmed her face, and the morning heat brought a kind of comfort she had never known. Fear still whispered now and then, but it didn't give orders anymore. She was learning how to live, and more than anything, how not to run. The changes were subtle, but you could see them. Mary noticed the girl laughed more easily now, sometimes even humming as she hung laundry on the line. Richard saw that she spoke while holding eye contact and no longer flinched at footsteps behind her. The house felt different too, fuller somehow, as if the air had started circulating again. Sometimes the three of them ate lunch on the porch, talking about the weather, the animals, the harvest. Simple conversations that carried the weight of what's real. Mary quietly saw a kind of miracle in that routine. The miracle of watching someone come back to life without having to erase the past. Grace, for her part, discovered small pleasures. The smell of bread coming out of the oven, the rain pattering on the roof, the cool touch of water as she washed the dishes. Things that once felt ordinary now meant freedom. Peace, she learned, isn't a place without noise. It's a place where the noise no longer hurts. One afternoon, Mary called her inside. She was sitting in the living room, holding an old wooden box. Sunlight poured through the window and made the dust float like tiny sparks. "Come here a moment," she said, lifting the lid. Inside were yellowed photos, letters, and a baby's pair of shoes. Mary took out a picture and showed it to Grace. In it, she and Richard were younger, smiling, a baby in their arms. "He was our boy," she said softly. Grace looked at the photo, then at Mary, not sure what to say. Mary went on, "We lost him very early, and since that day, I haven't been able to look at this picture. But when you came here, I think something in me opened again." Her voice shook, but her eyes were gentle. "You know, sometimes God doesn't give back what he took. He just sends someone to fill the empty space in a different way." Grace held the photo carefully, felt tears rise, and hugged Mary without a word. Later, Richard came in and found them still embracing. He didn't ask why. He sat in the armchair, looked at the two of them and smiled faintly. It was a tired smile, but a true one. Mary stood to make dinner while Grace put the photos back in the box, with the care of someone who understands the value of what remains. The house filled again with scents, wood smoke, warm food, life happening. When night fell, the rain began to drum softly and steadily on the roof. Grace helped set the table, lit the candles, and served the soup. Mary straightened the tablecloth, and Richard brought bread fresh from the oven. The three of them sat without ceremony, and for a while the only sound was the clink of cutlery on plates. No big words were spoken. They weren't needed. Peace sometimes explains itself. As they ate, Grace looked out the window and saw the lights trembling in the glass. Outside, the rain washed the earth, and its sound was the same she'd heard the night she arrived. But now it meant something else. Back then the rain brought terror. Now it brought comfort. Warmth spread through her chest, and she felt something simple but deep. She was standing on her own. Not because the past had vanished, but because she'd learned to carry what remained without letting its weight knock her down. When Mary offered more soup, she smiled and said yes. Richard made a comment about the field, and the two of them laughed. Life so ordinary and quiet felt extraordinary. It was the kind of peace that doesn't need to be announced. It just needs to be lived. That night, when she went upstairs, Grace opened her notebook and wrote the final page. The words flowed smooth and painless, as if they had been waiting for exactly this moment. Sometimes a fresh start doesn't come when we run. It comes when someone decides to stay. She closed the notebook, looked at the window, and watched the reflection of the lamp dancing on the wall. The rain fell outside, steady, and the farm slept in silence. Downstairs, Mary and Richard spoke in low voices, their laughter mingling with the wind. Grace lay down, pulled the wool blanket over herself, and closed her eyes. Fear hadn't disappeared. It had simply learned its place. And in that moment, between the sound of the rain and the warmth of home, she understood what peace really was. Not hiding anymore, just staying. The end. So what did you think of this story? Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to keep enjoying stories like this one. See you next time.